This video is sponsored by Raycon. Stories with perplexing details leave us wanting more, to get to the bottom of what truly transpired. As viewers of my channel will know, however, the whole picture is sometimes just out of reach, leaving us with an incomplete narrative. One such story brings us to 1960s Brazil, where two suited men were found lifeless side by side atop a hill, with no apparent signs of injury, along with raincoats, cryptic notes, and most bizarre of all, two crudely constructed lead masks in the shape of eyewear. This would later be dubbed by the media as the lead mask case, and it's been the source of wild speculation since the men were found nearly 6 decades ago. It's a tale laced with accusations of police negligence, possible third-party involvement, and even whispers about secret societies and UFO sightings. Whether this case is what it seems to be on the surface or not, the circumstances surrounding how these two men ended up on that hill are fascinating. August 17, 1966. Two close friends by the name of Miguel Jose Viana, 34, and Miguel Pereira de Cruz, 32, are about to embark on a journey together to buy a car and electronic equipment. Or at least that's what they told their wives when they packed up roughly 3 million cruzerios and set out to catch the 9 a.m. bus. Manuel and Miguel were both TV repairmen, so to their families, nothing about this trip seemed too far-fetched. The duo claimed they'd be heading all the way to Sao Paulo, some 400 miles away. Instead, however, they arrived in Niterói, just outside of Rio de Janeiro, something they'd intentionally planned on based on the bus tickets later recovered by authorities. This was at approximately 2 p.m., and over the course of the next couple hours, the men made several stops. They first visited an electronics shop, chatted with the owner, and left without making any purchases. Following this, they hopped from one store to another, buying a bottle of mineral water along with 2 raincoats to go over their suits. Later that afternoon, at about 5 p.m., a young local boy noticed the pair sitting atop Vintim Hill, but paid them no mind despite admittedly being curious given that these men were in formal attire and had donned the aforementioned raincoats. The next day, curiosity got the best of the boy, and that's when he decided to go and take a peek at the spot where he'd seen the men perched. Surprisingly, Miguel and Manuel were still there, just this time they were lying down. Assuming they were sleeping, the boy once again walked away. The boys' third encounter with the duo would by far be the most shocking. Once again in the area, the boy didn't see Manuel and Miguel, but he did smell something terrible. To his horror, the men hadn't been sleeping at all, but were in fact dead, their bodies in an advanced state of decomposition after being exposed to the elements for what at that point was over 3 days. Needless to say, this one is an absolute rabbit hole, but before we jump into the details, I just want to give a quick shout out to today's sponsor, Raycon. It's that time of year again, and when you're on the lookout for gifts everyone needs, Raycon is definitely a no-brainer. Whether it be listening to music, working from home, working out, or even winding down with audiobooks, Raycon has been my go-to for literal years at this point. You can't go wrong with their premium sound, useful features, 54-hour battery life, noise isolation, and my personal favorite, an almost custom-fit type feel that doesn't leave my ears sore at the end of the day. In case you're not sure where to start, Raycon is doing the work for you with their helpful gift guides, whether it be for the athlete or even the gamer in your life. The holidays generally bring with it a massive bite out of your wallet, which is why Raycon start at about half the price of other premium brands. And if you head over to buyraycon.com/rainbot and use code EARLYBF, you can enjoy 20% off site-wide on top of that. Depending on your needs, I'd also highly recommend saving 30% off with Raycon's exclusive holiday bundles, specifically the Everyday Duo bundle if you're looking to save while hitting 2 birds with 1 stone. Again, that's buyraycon.com/rainbot and code EARLYBF for 20% off site-wide, or go with a bundle and save 30% off this holiday season. Thanks again to Raycon for the support, and let's get right back into things. When authorities arrived on the scene, they were greeted with far more questions than answers. The first few were obvious. What were these two doing up in the hills dressed the way they were, and how did they die, given that there were no apparent signs of injury to either corpse? Beside the bodies was the water bottle they'd purchased just before making their way up the hill, but also present were two extremely bizarre things in particular. The first being a pair of DIY lead masks in the shape of glasses, and the second being some notes containing basic electrical equations, and most notably, the following instructions. Also of note was the fact that Miguel was reported to have roughly 157,000 crucerios on him while Manuel had just 4,000. A far cry from the combined 3 million or so they supposedly started with. The pair were quickly identified, which allowed authorities to cast a wide net for their initial investigation. To many, this may have seemed like it was Manuel and Miguel's intended outcome, but based on the notes, it's not hard to come to the conclusion that the men did not intend to die on that hill. If so, what really happened? Were they robbed, set up, maybe even gotten into some kind of accident? The first step would be to find out exactly what Manuel and Miguel were trying to do atop that hill, because buying a car definitely was not it. According to accounts at the time, the bodies of both men were sent in for autopsies and examined for signs of poisoning, all of which returned negative. With science unable to draw any conclusions, the authorities began turning to the pair's friends and family, all while the media began to fuel public speculation. One local man caught wind of the story and felt that he had information important to the case. He explained to authorities that on the night of August 17th, his wife and children had been driving nearby Ventum Hill and stopped to look at what appeared to be a UFO floating above it, or at least an oval object that appeared orange in color, which had what was described as a band of fire around its edges. Soon, other locals would come forward to corroborate this sighting. Meanwhile, the police managed to gather a fair bit of interesting information regarding the two friends. This is when the pair's cover story came to light via their widows, and even more would come from the men's direct family members. According to Miguel's sister, before his departure on August 17th, he'd explained that he had some kind of mission to carry out, and an important one at that. As for what it entailed, she claims he wouldn't say. Now, it's time that one Alicio Gomez would enter the picture, a name that you're going to hear a lot throughout the duration of this episode. Gomez was described by one of the widows as being Miguel and Manuel's assistant, but now he would become a suspect. Taken into custody for allegedly providing conflicting accounts, Gomez would go on to explain that the two men were what they called scientific spiritists. He claimed they'd engage in experiments and even ran a clandestine radio station in their spare time. Gomez would also explain that the men were a part of some kind of secret society, and that most TV repair technicians were also practicing scientific spiritism. Eventually, police would lose interest in Gomez, and while Manuel's widow had claimed to have seen the two having an argument, his brother would later go on record in a 90s TV documentary, stating he didn't suspect Gomez of foul play. Either way, police were on the lookout for a possible third person. In the documentary just mentioned, it was also stated that the men were found with foliage on the ground that had been neatly cut with some kind of blade, but no such tool or item was ever recovered from the scene. Also puzzling was the fact that, according to reports at the time, the note on the men didn't bear their handwriting. Maybe what's even more curious here is the fact that Manuel and Miguel aren't even the first lead mask case. In 1962, a man by the name of Hermes, also a TV repairman, was found dead atop a hill. This case, however, has been mostly lost to time and therefore lacks sufficient details to connect it to what happened in 1966. Scientific spiritism. This may sound a tad confusing since most people are used to hearing the word spiritualism, and even then the word means different things depending on who you ask. Either way, spiritism and spiritualism are not exactly the same thing, even if they very much sound like it. As far as contemporary movements go, spiritualism is generally agreed as having been popularized in earnest by the Fox sisters in 1848 after they supposedly channeled a spirit right before their neighbors' eyes from right within the comfort of their upstate New York home. Word quickly spread about the girls' feat, paving the way for a sort of spiritualist craze at the time. This is where a lot of classic iconography of spirit communication comes from, especially the more theatrical things like seances while gathered around a table, for example. Just over a decade later, spirit photography came onto the scene and really has not gone away ever since. Needless to say, people were dabbling in all manner of new attempts to unravel the mysteries of the afterlife, and it wasn't limited to just everyday citizens. According to WhiteHouseHistory.org, First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln practiced spiritualism, first doing so after the death of her second youngest son in 1862, when the boy was just 11 years old. Eventually, Mary would hold seances in the Red Room of the White House, some of which were attended by none other than President Abraham Lincoln himself. While probably the most noteworthy practitioners of spiritualism in this era, the Lincolns were far from the only prominent names on that roster. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was an outspoken advocate for spiritualism, and while not necessarily sold on spiritualist methods, Thomas Edison even joined the fold at one point with his attempt at creating a telephone that could contact those on the other side. Speaking of the other side, spiritualism had also had its fair share of critics, the most notable of which probably being Harry Houdini. While most people know of Houdini for his work as a magician and escape artist, he also spent a considerable amount of energy debunking fraudulent mediums, even going as far as to testify in front of Congress hoping to get fortune-telling banned in Washington, D.C. With such big names battling at either side of the spectrum, it's not hard to see just how widespread spiritualism had become at the time. That said, spiritualism was never a formal movement. It wasn't founded by a singular individual and codified, but Spiritism was. Spiritism is considered to have gotten its start in 1857, more than a decade after the Fox sisters had thrown the US into a paranormal frenzy. More specifically, its origins hail from a book, simply called The Spirit Book, authored by French educator Allan Kardec. Kardec had also gotten caught up in the spectacle of seances and spirit communication, which led him to digging into mediumship himself, eventually birthing what he called Spiritism, which he described as, quote, a science which deals with the nature, origin, and destiny of spirits, as well as their relationship with the corporeal world. Today, both spiritualism and spiritism live on in various forms all across the globe, but when it comes to spiritism in particular, there's one country that stands out from the rest. And that, of course, brings us back to Brazil. In the late 60s and 70s, spiritism experienced a surge in popularity thanks to the works of philanthropist Chico Xavier, who wrote books on the subject and even appeared on national television a number of times, setting records while doing so. Towards the end of his life, Xavier would be nominated by over 2 million people to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Needless to say, the man was popular, and today Brazil is said to have the largest concentration of spiritists on the planet at approximately 4 million strong. Just like any idea and with spiritualism before it, spiritism has splintered off into an infinite amount of forms that vary from follower to follower. With this in mind, we can now turn our attention back to Miguel and Manuel. A book on spiritism was found in Miguel's workshop alongside remnants of lead, the pages highlighting sections about mass, intense light, and of course, spirits. Now, this is where Manuel and Miguel really seem to apply their own flair to this. According to Gomez, the pair had long held hopes of communicating with beings on Mars, presumably what they considered to be Martian spirits. They did this through experiments, one of which would even fuel local myths of UFOs and extraterrestrial life. June 13th, 1966. Residents of Campos are witnessing what they believe to be a UFO floating above the water just offshore. Whatever this object was, it was bright. So bright, in fact, that some described it as almost blinding. After just several minutes, the object began to rise, and soon after, it exploded, the boom being so loud that it was allegedly heard from miles away. Locals in the area, and in particular fishermen who had a front row seat, claim that they saw the UFO fall into the sea. This event caused enough of a ruckus for Brazilian military intelligence to get involved, although not much details on their findings seems to have made its way to the public eye. They do mention having intercepted some kind of bizarre conversation over the radio on June 12th, but that's as much as anyone seems to know on that topic. That said, I'm sure you can already see where I'm going with this. According to Gomez, he was invited by our two lead-masked men to attend an experiment in Manuel's garden, something that was also confirmed by Manuel's very own father as having taken place. Although the details are unclear, Gomez explained that the friends had created some kind of device, and we can only assume that it exploding was not part of their plan. Whatever this device was, it sounds strikingly similar to the one supposedly seen by locals at Vinton Hill on that fateful August 17th evening. It seems the men were once again trying to use a device as part of their communication with extraterrestrial spirits, only this time there didn't seem to be an explosion so much as just the device going up in flames. Whatever happened, it doesn't seem like this part of the experiment caused Manuel and Miguel's deaths since, again, there were no signs of injury to either body. With all of these factors in mind, really the only logical explanation we're left with is that whatever these men ingested is what killed them, but what about the autopsy and toxicology reports? Well, as you might expect, that's probably the most hotly contested part of this case. There are so many different heads talking at once that when it comes to the science here, it's not easy to figure out who to believe. We do know almost for certain that there were capsules involved, and presumably the men did take them based on the bottle of water that they bought on their way to the hill. Still, nowhere in my research did I find any reports about either the whole capsules or the remnants being found anywhere over the course of the investigation. In the 90s TV documentary, the medical examiner who worked on the case said himself that the men had been thoroughly examined for signs of poisoning, and that parts of their organs were even dissected in the process. Whether or not this is actually true, we'll never know. Some claim that the advanced state of decomposition could have gotten in the way of such things, and even more concerning is the fact that one of the medical examiners allegedly wanted his name removed from the initial report for unknown reasons. About a year after Manuel and Miguel were found, their bodies were exhumed and tested once again for toxins. With hair tests, they searched for arsenic, mercury, barium, and thallium, the results of which are arsenic 0.0000041%, mercury, barium, and thallium all at 0.0001%. Experts at the Atomic Energy Institute in Sao Paulo claim that this proves scientifically that the deaths of these men were not caused by any of these specific poisons. Of course, this doesn't necessarily rule out poisoning altogether. One of the most bizarre details in this case is the claim that the grass where the bodies were found had died off and never grew back. I fell into a bit of a rabbit hole trying to figure out if this is normal or not, and it turns out that based on what I could find, the answer is sort of. Obviously, every individual case varies, but in general, it's said that the grass does indeed die off, but after some amount of time it grows back faster and stronger than before. As for why the grass never grew back where Manuel and Miguel were found, well, some assume it's due to whatever was in their systems when they passed away, but unfortunately this detail about the grass isn't exactly well documented enough to draw any conclusions. Again, just too many variables and not enough data on the state of the grass over the years following the incident. Still, I did think it was fascinating enough to quickly bring up before we move on to our next section. It goes without saying that due to several factors at play here, the best we can really do is speculate based on the information we have available. This case has way too much going on and not enough concrete facts to actually definitively prove what happened that day on Vinton Hill. If we're to believe official reports, the men had no signs of poisoning whatsoever, but if we consider the fact that they might be wrong for some reason, then that brings up a few new questions. Again, based on all these circumstantial evidence, it doesn't seem like Manuel and Miguel planned to spend their last moments atop the hill, but rather they took the capsules as planned and did not realize what it would do to them. For a lot of people, this is where they close things up and call it good, but this does beg the question: who gave them the capsules and did they know it would kill these men? Per the notes, the lead masks were worn for protection, presumably against harsh light, but also probably against radiation the men were expecting to be exposed to. It's possible that they were duped into thinking whatever they were taking would help protect them, or maybe even just help heighten their senses to make contact easier. Earlier in this episode, I mentioned a couple of loose factors, mainly the fact that a lot of the men's money had gone missing and the detail about the neatly cut foliage, but those are not the only elements pointing to a possible third person. The first assumption here would be that the third person had to be Gomez, but for one reason or another, police felt comfortable enough with ruling him out. They were too busy following other leads, at one point claiming to be searching for a car that was allegedly used to get the men to the base of Vinton Hill, and in 1968, a suspect described as a blonde man had entered the fold. Said man was said to have been sighted with Manuel and Miguel before their deaths. Technically speaking, even though the actual cause of death was never determined, this case to many is considered solved. That's because in 1969, a report came out regarding one man's shocking confession. Already in prison serving a lengthy sentence for prior unrelated offenses, it seemed he had nothing to lose when he confessed to a relative that he was behind the infamous lead mask case. Bizzani claims that things went down like this. He and some of his colleagues spotted Miguel and Manuel that fateful day in August, and having overheard that they were on their way to buy a car, the group decided that these men were to be their targets. They made themselves appear friendly, offering to drive Miguel and Manuel to Vintom Hill, and this is where things allegedly took a turn for the worse. The pair were forced to trek up to the summit, then they were given no choice but to ingest the poison capsules. The criminals made off with their money, and it's allegedly as simple as that. Now, it goes without saying that there are a number of issues with the story. For one, the boy responsible for finding Miguel and Manuel allegedly saw them sitting atop Vintom Hill on August 17th. At no point was a group of people mentioned, and neither was any sort of confrontation. There's a number of ways that the situation could have played out, but is Bizzani trying to claim that he wrote the cryptic notes that were found on the men? It seems unlikely. Now, let's say the note, capsules, everything, were all Miguel and Manuel's like we suspect. Why even bother making them hike all the way up the hill just to force them to take some pills? One could assume that it was not to make a scene, but why did the men have their raincoats on? It seems unlikely that they would have been allowed to put them on while being threatened. All of those details are pretty wishy-washy, but what about the so-called UFO that half the town witnessed? We all know that said UFO was most likely the result of whatever experiment Miguel and Manuel were conducting, and if said experiment was allowed to happen at all, it seems unlikely that Bizzani's version of events is accurate. On top of that, they claim to have robbed the men, but if so, why leave behind a chunk of cash rather than taking everything that they had? Then, of course, there's the good old lead mass. At what point did they allow the men to take those out, and for what purpose? Now, that of course brings us into the territory of false confessions. Most people believe that a confession means case closed automatically, but this is a long-standing misconception that somehow manages to survive despite what history tells us time and time again. False confessions, for one reason or another, do happen. In the case of Bizzani, it might have just been easier to make this up since he was already locked up. So, what's his deal? Honestly, no clue. It could have just been the result of boredom or even an attempt at gaining notoriety by taking credit for a high-profile case. Both the media and authorities seemed way too quick to accept this version of events as truth, but the same can't be said for many members of the public. They, understandably, were quite skeptical, the assumption here being that the police wanted to push Bizzani's story to take the focus off the potential incompetence that got in the way of a clear answer regarding this case. If you'll recall, some blonde man was considered a suspect at one point, but that lead seems to have evaporated once this confession emerged. There's no way to know for sure what happened to Manuel and Miguel or the circumstances surrounding their deaths, but in my personal opinion, these men most likely did make their way up Vintom Hill by choice, and did follow the instructions that were found on them. An experiment seemed to have taken place, but were these men taken advantage of or even deliberately taken out by whoever supplied them with the capsules? If so, why? The money, although not a massive amount, could potentially be a motive, but to know for sure, the investigation would have had to lean more heavily on people that knew the pair rather than some shady group of randoms like we're supposed to believe. Based on the autopsy issue, it does seem that there was most likely negligence somewhere down the line, and since it's maybe the most important step of this whole thing, said negligence seems to have barred us from any concrete answers. Regardless, the story of Miguel and Manuel is fascinating, even if it's just about two friends who wanted to talk to spirits on Mars. For now, though, all we can do is wonder.